And we are live. Welcome back to the Placemakers. You are joining Education today with us live. We've got Mike Cross. Mike is the founder, the CEO of Athlete Viewpoint. Has worked in college athletics throughout his career, and I think athletics has taken such an interesting sort of role in this idea of placemaking. So we're really, really excited to have you here. And I want to jump right in if we can do that, because coronavirus has become the topic of the day when we think about higher education and what's going on. And we had planned to talk about a whole bunch of things, but really over the last couple of days, as we've seen spikes in and around college campuses, what I've sort of decided is that COVID's, as much of it is an accelerator of some of the changes happening in higher education. I also think it's a little bit of a revealer of truths. And one of the truths that feels like it's being revealed right now, Mike, is that that college athletics, as much as I love it, as much as I am a fan, as much as I believe in what it does on a college campus in terms of placemaking, it feels like the truth is really being revealed. It's not debatable anymore that this is a business, and it's a big business, so much so that we've put college athletes in a position that they're really our guinea pigs right now in higher education. We've pushed them to the front of the line and said, let's see how this works. And so I want your take on that. I mean, am I just really, really jaded on what everything that's happening? And missing something, or are we really a little bit lost right now?
Yeah, it's a great and easy softball lead in there, TJ.
Right, we'll start it easy.
For starting out with that. So, look, I think that from a basic standpoint, one of the frame then. So, unlike pro sports where these are independently owned businesses and you've got franchise owners and that type of thing, college athletics is different. We're in the academy. The business of college athletics, if you want to use that phrase, looks different to different people. And if you think about your listenership that you have across your podcast, you've got people who are at some of the largest institutions in the country that probably have a Division I sports program, that may have a very large football stadium and a successful basketball team. And there's other people on your podcast who are at the Division III level, and perhaps athletics means a very different piece of the equation for their campus environment. So, the business of college athletics, and has it gotten too big, is an interesting question. I think the tendency is to focus on what people see every day. The ESPN highlights, full stadiums, attention to two primary revenue generating sports in football and men's basketball.
Right.
And those are the types of things that get the lion's share of attention. But you've got exponentially more student athletes participating in the other sports across 3 divisions than you do in just those sports. So that's a distinction I make right out of the gate. And again, athletics means different things to different people in different campuses.
So that said, when we, and I want to focus on both of those ideas. If we were to focus on the big athletics, the group that we talked about, what are there, 20 programs in the country that maybe make money for their institution? Outside of that, it largely costs, particularly students, some amount of money. So for those big institutions, for those places that are generating dollars predominantly through football and through basketball and those types of things, when we think about that as a business, I find it really interesting and want your take on this, that the NCAA is notorious for regulating everything, right? And it's at a cost. They'll regulate how many sandwiches a kid's allowed to get and where they're allowed to get them from, but hasn't, to my knowledge, come out and started to regulate anything as it relates to testing for COVID. I think there have been some rules as it relates to sort of safe return to play, but even at UCLA, I know that student athletes have come together and demanded third-party testing because they did, and I would suspect that shows some lack of trust with the institution itself. So can you talk a little bit about, one, am I right that there's a lack of regulation on testing, and why might that be? What does that say about coronavirus and student athletes and the position of student athletes as it relates to the business?
Yeah, it's a good question. So let me go back to what your original premise was, which was there's 20 some institutions that make revenue on make money, if you will. And we'll call that profitable. That at the end of the day, your income from some number of sources, which could be television, ticket sales, concessions, parking, development dollars, student fees, et cetera, is greater than the amount that's being spent as it relates to scholarships for student athletes, salaries, travel, et cetera. If I'm going to put a plug for the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics, okay, if your listeners want to educate themselves very quickly and very rapidly about just how those dollars are spent, that is an unbelievably great resource. They've got an incredible financial database where people can go and understand very quickly the differences between the schools across the Division I landscape and to how their dollars are brought in and how those dollars are spent. So I encourage your listeners to go to the Mike Commission's website. From there, you get into the question of, okay, the regulation that comes from the NCAA. And the interesting thing about it is, and what I think a lot of people don't realize is that the NCAA, let me back up. The money that comes into athletic departments for the most part comes from football. Okay, so that is your biggest revenue driver by a large extent. The revenue that comes from football is not football is not a championship sport within the NCAA. So you're operating within a bowl system, and more importantly, you're operating within the college football playoff. And the amount of money that is generated by the college football playoff that goes back to the institutions that have an opportunity to participate in that, and their conferences, and the other FBS institutions is enormous. It's hundreds of millions of dollars.
Right.
And those dollars, since they are not under the NCAA's control, the ability to put in place some of the types of regulations that you're suggesting and talking about is, I do think, a bit challenged. There have been athletic administrators that have been quoted in the media who have come out very clearly and said, these are decisions we will make, the NCAA won't make them for us. Now, that being said, nobody gets to operate as an island. You've got to operate within your conference. You've got to operate and be a good partner, and you have to have people to play against. So you've got to make sure that you're working collaboratively and putting things together as it relates to testing, as it relates to all those types of things. But the idea of a national standard of what athletic return should look like is immensely challenging. You've got different states across conferences, you've got different sports being played, you've got different levels of infection. So you put all those factors together, and to come up with a strong policy that said, here's all the things that have to happen, I think is tricky. I think there's value in institutions saying, here's the protocols we're going to put in place. We're going to test X number of times in the following ways, in the following circumstances. We're going to contact trace in the following ways. And I think institutions and athletic departments are going to put an unbelievable amount of effort into making sure that the things they can control within the four walls, if you want to talk metaphorically, of athletics and what happens at practice, what happens in the strength and conditioning setting, what happens in competition, those are settings you can control. I think the challenge is much greater outside of those controlled spaces. And it's, what does it look like when you travel through an airport? What does it look like when you go and compete in a full stadium or a partially full stadium? What does it look like when you go and compete against another team, and the testing protocols of those teams or that team that you're playing against may be different, perhaps because of differences in philosophy, or perhaps because of differences in resources to be able to afford the cost of testing in the first place. So that's where some of this starts to get more complicated very quickly. And whether it's because of geography, social distancing practices, et cetera, everybody's facing a different set of circumstances, and everybody is coming at this topic from different places. And there's going to be a lot of things that are going to happen probably in the next 30 days that are really going to sort out what the fall looks like for people.
Right. Yeah. Before we went live, you had said, we made it by the 4th of July, and it feels like we've sort of hit this pivot point where decisions are going to be made. And it does sort of feel that way. It feels like we've turned a little bit of a corner. Everybody was excited about the holiday weekend, and then came back from the holiday weekend and now sort of has their finger in the air, and they're testing the waters to see where we're gonna land. And I think your point about, it's all kind of tricky, to me, that really is the point, that we've made college athletics as a business a very, very tricky thing because of all the reasons that you just mentioned. As an example, I was eavesdropping on a call earlier with some colleagues where somebody mentioned athletics, and they said, we can't afford to be the one who cancels this game because it's going to cost us X number of dollars in cancellation fees. And I thought, what an interesting premise, that it's sort of waiting to see who blinks first to incur the cancellation fee. And at no point was there any discussion about this idea of student athlete safety or fan safety, or athletics aside, should we even have the institution open or not? I thought it was just a very interesting sort of juxtaposition of topics right now, considering that public health and safety feels like it ought to be number one, but there's a lot of things underlying that are driving decision making that are not necessarily tied into public health and safety.
It should be number one. I think for many people it is number one. But you hit upon the issue is that health and safety takes a lot of different forms, and in different places that might look differently. And ultimately, if you're in a situation where you've got a budget, and I made the comment before about athletics being a microcosm of its institution, our institutions of higher education, with very few exceptions, are living paycheck to paycheck.
Sure.
And as are our athletic programs. And so we're relying on tuition dollars in most cases. We're relying on some endowment in a lot of cases. Maybe you got some federal money or some state money that comes in. But the economics of higher education, we haven't had a lot of rainy day funds that have been established in most cases. And now we're in a situation where you've got declining student population in the first place. You've got all kinds of reasons about why people do not necessarily want to go and have their freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior year be taken remotely and online. And it's really calling into question the extent to which the educational environment is fulfilling and achieving the promise that it puts out there, I think, in its brochures. Sure. Huge challenge for sure. I mean, there are all kinds of issues that are popping up related to interaction of generations, where you've got older staff who may or may not be comfortable interacting with students who are, I think, have demonstrated pretty well at this point, don't care to social distance as much as some of us older types might want to. And I can understand why. I can think back to being that age, and I'm not sure how well I would have listened either, to tell you the truth. Sure. So those are real challenges we're all facing. But the cost of college, the cost of higher education generally has shown no cap. We continue to figure out ways to spend, again, as fast as it comes in. And some of the things that people think about doing at the margins, you get into conversations about, geez, does athletics spend too much? Or, those are not solutions to much bigger systemic challenges that are out there.
Well, and I feel like we've sort of made the full circle now. We started with talking about the big programs, the profitable programs, and now we're sort of alluding to and hitting at everybody else, the other 90-some%. And knowing what you just said about the ROI of higher education, which is in question, the cost of higher education, which has gone up 1,400% over the last 50 years, knowing that wages have remained flat for college graduates, which impacts that ROI. And then knowing college athletics cost students money outside of those big money making organizations or the profitable organizations, what logic is there to saving college athletics in some of those other spaces when it comes to those D3 programs, those other places? Is there something special about, because at the end of the day, college athletes represent what percentage of the student population? It's fairly small. So knowing that we're serving a very, very small percentage in terms of experientially, is there something about college athletics on college campuses in terms of placemaking and in terms of sense of belonging that really should be the overriding driver for how we're making decisions about cutting these programs or not in these cost conscious times?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm going to answer it for sure. I want to. You've mentioned the phrase ROI, and I want to throw out another resource there.
Yeah.
The Wall Street Journal has done a fair amount of research about this topic, and in fact, there are some research tools on, I believe, Tableau that I have used previously, and I'll try and send them to you after the
we'll get them in the show notes.
You can get them in the show. And unbelievable tool that basically looks at almost all the colleges and universities across the country and will plot, here's what it costs to go, here's what your 20-year salary is going to be 20 years after the fact, and they put it into 4 quadrants. Here's the most, the biggest ROI, here's bad ROI, and you've got a fair number of schools who are negative ROI after 20 years, which is an unbelievable thing to think about. So anyway, but I digress. Let me go to your question. When you think about colleges and universities trying to understand why do we do what we do with athletics, I think there's 6 things that you've got to look at to try and consider whether what they're doing makes sense. I'm going to throw them out there to you. One, So long story short, what is the rationale for college athletics? Move it out of the student, let's educate students, let's provide them a great experience. What's the business rationale of a college or university deciding to do what they do as it relates to college athletics, whether they're Division I, Division II, Division III, NAIA, or no athletics whatsoever? 6 things. I think one has to do with undergraduate admissions. There is clearly demonstrated research that shows that success in athletics can help you with undergraduate admissions. Increased number of applications, increased quality of applications. If you were to talk to the people at Clemson right now, I think they would very much back up that story. I think Alabama would also suggest the same thing as it relates to their football program. And you've seen this in other instances as well, where institutions will pop up on the radar screen. Take an institution like Gonzaga, I'm not sure which way to say it,
Sure.
but in the Pacific Northwest,
Right.
that's an institution that, private Catholic institution that probably wasn't on a lot of people's radar screens until a few years ago. And all of a sudden they got applications coming in because of the success of their basketball program. So
Right.
that piece of, as it relates to undergraduate admissions, that's one rationale for doing this. Second one is town and gown relationships. The revenue that can be driven by colleges and university athletic programs and colleges and universities generally is undisputable. I mean, you look at the number of towns that have popped up around colleges and universities, particularly larger state institutions. I'm sitting in a town called State College, Pennsylvania, that is a pretty good example of what that phenomenon is like. But the town and gown relationship is important for tax revenue. It's important for a whole host of things. That's a second rationale for why you're doing what you're doing with athletics. I think the third rationale has to do with development and fundraising and alumni relations. The opportunity to bring in donors, provide them an environment where they can feel part of something bigger than themselves, be surrounded by pomp and circumstance. The band is playing, the cheerleaders are doing their thing. You think back to your days when you were an undergraduate. All of those things have tremendous value. You can debate whether that's appropriate or not, but I don't see a lot of people doing fundraising around poetry slams and those types of things. So that's just a factual reality of the United States of America, and there's a high level of passion for sport. Fourth reason is financial. There's a number of different reasons why that makes sense. One is ticket sales, television, all those types of things. But there's also tuition dollars depending on the type of institution that you're at, where every student athlete who comes to your institution is paying a tuition check. If you're a Division III institution where there's no athletic aid, that's tuition dollars coming to your institution. Even at the Division I level, not every student athlete, despite perceptions, is on a scholarship. And most of the sports are actually what are called equivalency scholarships, where student athletes receive a fraction of a full scholarship. So while not 100% tuition paying, there is a whole line of thought about the relationship between the number of athletes you have and possible tuition revenue generation. And in fact, we talk to schools at Athlete Viewpoint, and we talk to schools where 2/3 to 3/4 of their student population are athletes. Like, that is a very real model for some of the schools that are out there. So that is not the norm, but I think it is a trend that you're going to see continuing. And there are schools that expand and grow their athletic program very deliberately and purposely to try and entice students who played through high school and want a chance to compete at the college level because they continue to enjoy it and it means something for them. So they'll pay those tuition dollars. And then the last two reasons, one has to do with branding and publicity. And we've talked about that already in terms of, you got the ESPN ticker, you got, advertising, a week's worth of advertising for a big game for some of these institutions where your number 7 football team is playing the number 10 football team. It's on a Saturday in late fall, right around the admissions time, has unbelievable value that you simply can't put a price tag on it. And there's studies that are done about that. And then the last issue is what I would term the benefit of association. And the reason this works well for people is, in a lot of cases, institutions get to say what type of institution they are by who they surround themselves with. Show me your friends and I'll understand more about who you are. So I think one of the most cohesive groups along those lines is the Ivy League. Okay, and I don't want to pick who the best and worst institution in the Ivy League is, but if you're the best institution in the Ivy League, you get to say, look, we're the best institution in the Ivy League. if you're, let's say, the eighth institution in the Ivy League, and I'm
You'd
not
say
going to
we're in
name
the
any of
Ivy
it,
League.
but I'm in the Ivy League,
That's
like
right.
that. There's
Right,
there's a
right.
real value to that, and that happens over and over. That happens in the ACC, that happens in the Pac-12, and when you go through those conferences and look at who you decide to affiliate with and associate with, the halo effect of who you've surrounded yourself with, and you saw this with conference shuffling a few years ago, is incredibly important. And it happens in an athletic context, but the framing and the meaning for the other aspects of the institution are undeniable. And the clamor for people to trying to get into other conferences is real. And it's real because of athletics, and it's real because of the dollars that go with athletics, but it's real for other reasons. And that's a practical reality about, I want to associate with people who are going to lift my profile, lift my brand. And simultaneously, people want to surround themselves with the same types of brands that are going to help make their brand better. And that's what you
Sure.
see all the time.
And I coming from a lens of a student affairs professional, somebody who's always thinking about the student experience outside the classroom, particularly, it feels like you could almost add a seventh to that list in terms of what is the rationale, and it's that it feels as though there might be a turning of this tide as it relates to the impact of student athletes on values and on culture and on climate. We're seeing student athletes right now step forward and have power on their campuses. We see it in professional sports. It's highlighted all the time right now. But now we're seeing it in college athletics as well. They're having some power on the overall culture and being able to make statements and being able to make, I'll say, even demands and get some traction there. And so I know that some of the work you do at Athlete Viewpoint really digs into the student's perspective, hence the name, in a way that I don't know that everybody has in the past. So can you talk a little bit about where are student athletes generally right now as it relates to some of these cultural things that are happening in the world? And if you can share some examples of how that number 7 might be working. Are we turning a little bit where student athletes have a more powerful sort of role in that world right now?
Yeah, the voice of the student athlete in athletics, I think, has never been greater. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is the social environment and the environment in which we're seeing things like we've never seen before. And they're brought to this generation of students in ways that I, as a student athlete, simply didn't have. I didn't have a computer in my hand, a phone in my hand,
Right.
where it brought me a constant stream of information. It didn't have an ability to capture the images that we see, both positive and negative, in ways that I think more rapidly inform, but not necessarily educate. And I think there's this distinction there. People have a lot of information. Being able to separate those pieces and understand what the truth is around a lot of these different things, I think, is a huge challenge. You've got lots of divergent views about what the truth means. All you have to do is look at a couple different news channels, and you're going to have a very different worldview very quickly about what's going on out in the world.
Right.
Um, and those are real differences, driven to try and generate eyeballs, trying to sell advertising and those types of things. But but that social environment is where it starts, and the information flow that comes in is where it starts. And then from there, the NCAA made some very conscious choices a few years ago to give student athletes a voice in their decision making. So the NCAA board of not the board of directors, but the NCAA governance model, I should say, provides, there's a student council that allows student athletes to weigh in on legislation, provide insight. Every campus in the country has its own student athlete advisory committee that will give input to the administration about what their experience is. And you're seeing that at the conference level. So unlike 10 years ago, let's say, where that was probably a more novel concept, I think that's the standard practice that's happening today. And then a huge factor that's out there, and this goes back to some of your comments earlier about the revenue generating sports, is for a segment of our student athletes, I think they feel like they are experiencing injustice. And
Mm.
the injustice in this case is economic. They look and see uh, people who are making multiple millions of dollars, and I don't begrudge any of those individuals making those dollars, but they see that. They know they have restrictions in their lives about what they're able to do. or not do as it relates to monetizing their name, image, and
Mhm.
likeness, as it relates to being able to sell a product. And those rules are changing as we speak, and they're being evaluated and being put in place. But the movement that happened in California to push through legislation, interestingly, happened and was announced in a sports context. It was announced on LeBron James's I don't know if it's a
Right.
podcast or television show, but there are approaches and recognition for going back decades that athletics improve and be better, and that's the reality we're seeing right here now, as it relates to social justice issues, as it relates to calls for economic parity for student athletes, as it relates to a whole variety of things. And I'm excited to see where some of these things go with the student athletes. You've got some incredibly smart, hardworking individuals who really
Right.
know what their values are, what the pulse is that they want to see their world look like. And much like generations prior, they're going to try and put their stamp on it. But I think their ability to put a stamp on it is much different and much more powerful than it has been previously, primarily because of the technology that can amplify their voice in a matter of seconds.
Yeah, it's really been interesting to me to see. I mean, what we've talked about a little bit is that brands do not have the opportunity to be neutral anymore. You've got to make a value statement one way or the other. And universities, college and universities certainly are brands. And it's interesting to see student athletes having a pulpit now that they really didn't have in the past, even with the or the regulation that you talked about in terms of, a council and things like that. I really think it's technology and it's social and it's the rest of the world embracing them. When I see Scotty Lewis from the University of Florida basketball team stand up in front of a protest and it get aired on ESPN, I don't know that we ever would have seen that with a college athlete in the past in the way that we are now. And players are coming together and saying, look, we're not going to play unless these types of things happen at our institution. I think it's a really interesting point in time. And I'm interested to see how college athletes and college athletics can be used for good social change at the institutional level. It's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I
Go
was
ahead.
going to follow up on that really quickly. We did a study recently about COVID-19 and what student athletes are experiencing as it relates to both their online learning experience, the support they got from their institutions, and what they wanted to see happen in the future. And for the most part, the good news was student athletes felt like they were supported. They felt like their coaches cared. They were engaged. Huge positive of the research that we did. They also really want to return to play.
Mhm.
So going to some of the undercurrent of our student athletes being used in inappropriate ways. Many of them want to be out there. That's not a universal view by any stretch of the imagination,
Right.
but many of them want the opportunity to compete. As somebody who is affiliated closely with a team at Penn State, our men's hockey team had won the Big Ten championship,
Hmm.
regular season championship, lost the opportunity to go to the NCAA postseason and compete for a national championship. That's an opportunity those individuals will never get back. And the life of an athlete is finite, particularly in the NCAA, if you're not going to go on and play
Right.
professionally. So they don't want to lose those opportunities. Those matter. And they matter to the students very, very deeply and personally, much like we talked about
Right.
before about institutions using enrollment management via athletics, because people want to continue to play. This matters and gives a meaning to them as they grow up. So tie that in with I would say a modest success as it relates to the academic piece and the online learning they went through. They are going to share their views and they want to see the opportunity to compete. I don't think it's at all costs, but I do think there's a different narrative that's out there related to, geez, we're forcing athletes to do
Sure.
this. Some may feel that way, but you can't say that at the Division 2 or 3 level, where they're probably paying their own way to go to the institution. They still want to do
Right.
that. So
Well, and your
um,
point about the life of a student athlete being finite is really important and really interesting. And particularly, I was talking with a friend who works in college athletics about baseball and how college baseball really is in maybe the toughest spot. They lose a whole season, and when they come back now, if they extend the seniors' opportunity to continue to play, but still take on freshmen. what do you do? Do you expand your roster? Do you share playing time? You've taken what is this finite blocked thing, and you've made it not work. Essentially, it's going to be a really, really interesting thing. And baseball is one of the most interesting sports in terms of the timeline of the draft, and kids can get drafted and still play. There's all kinds of really interesting things as it relates to baseball that don't apply to some other sports. So I thought that was interesting. I want to pivot a little bit and ask you, one of the, maybe it's a criticism that I've had, or an observation that I've had about college athletics, is that college athletics tends to mirror or create a second institution within the institution at times. So while the institution has enrollment and academic advising and financial aid and all these other departments, oftentimes, particularly in big programs, but it really does happen across the board in some instances, that there is sort of this mirrored institution within the institution serving this small percentage of the student population. Can you talk a little bit about maybe why that is? And, from a layperson's perspective, I look at that and I go, wow, what a waste from a bureaucracy perspective, from a redundancy perspective, from a cost perspective. Am I wrong? What are we missing about why that is, and how that might work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think you're wrong. I do think there is some redundancy in the system. The more important question probably has to do with why. So why do you go and have these?
Yeah.
We've got counselors on campus. Why does athletics have counselors? We've got academic advisors on campus. Why does athletics have those? So I think there's a few different reasons. One, I'm going to start with the NCAA. Okay, there's expectations for eligibility. There's expectations as it relates to recruiting. There's expectations as it relates to financial aid, and all of this massive 500-600 page rule book that we operate under. Much of that rule book comes from competitive advantages that people had and think are appropriate or inappropriate, and so we regulate ourselves to this stage. And once you start creating this book, much like you see in government, as that rule book or the laws grow, you have to have more and more people to enforce them and reinforce them in order to make sure that everybody's doing the things they're supposed to do. So the bureaucracy of the NCAA has a real cost. There's no question about it. From there, I talked about eligibility already, and there's an educational component. I mean, at the end of the day, I would suggest to you there are the high touch, highly personal educational experience that we're providing our student athletes. All students should have that. I mean, I don't think that the athletes should have it and the other athletes should not, but because of other reasons that I'm touching upon, that happens. It happens in some pretty meaningful ways. There's a trade-off as it relates to the athlete's freedom, and there's some things they give up there, but there's no doubt that there's some repeat pieces in that piece of the equation. I think the other piece is this goes to recruiting and competitive issues. And if you think about, I mentioned before, the microcosm of athletics within the institution. Our institutions right now are out there trying to figure out, how do I recruit more students? They're building nicer facilities. They're building climbing walls. They've got really nice dining centers. They're going to put more counseling resources. They're going to be all things to all people. The same thing is happening in athletics. Just like institutions are going to say, we're going to be all things to all people, athletics is doing the exact same thing. And it gets to the issue of commitment. It gets to the issue of showing that you can prepare people for opportunities beyond college, and who's going to set them up best to do that. So that might be play professional sports. That might be go get a job in your chosen field. But in the same way people are trying to choose institutions, non-athlete students are trying to choose institutions on a whole variety of factors. Athletic departments are doing the exact same thing and trying to entice somebody who largely has the same type of needs, except you've got this athletic need as well that you've got to try and fulfill. Sure. So we replicate it, and we do it at a really high level, because ultimately, if you don't do those things, it's going to translate to losses rather than wins. And the types of things that we talk about as relate to branding, quality of institution, et cetera, I think start to suffer when you're not winning. The hard part is the zero-sum game. If we only have one winner and one loser in pretty much everything except soccer. So
so we always like to end this show thinking about opportunities. We never want to let any crisis go wasted, and I think we have some opportunities. And for you, I think it's a special sort of question. It's a two-part question as it relates to opportunities for higher education, what are some things that higher education as an industry can learn from the microcosm of college athletics as an industry? And then the second part of that, sort of the more general piece, is what can athletics change right now or during this period of time where everything is in flux and transition to ensure that we come out on the other side of this thing maybe better as an industry?
Two really good questions. So, um, the opportunities that I see are a few, and one I'm gonna talk about the use of data. That's what our company does, but data cuts in a whole lot of different directions. What we've found is that as we go through and survey our student athletes, get information about their experiences, and share that with athletic departments, the people that we partner with are being very purposeful as it relates to taking that information and then trying to make good decisions. And good decisions can mean a lot of different things. Good decisions can mean, hey, should we invest in resources to improve a facility? Or that information can also tie to things like, let's talk about this program that's underperforming and evaluate why
Mm,
that's happening. Do we have weakness in an assistant coach? Do we have a head coach who needs to communicate better? Like, there's a whole variety of things, and that data, which comes directly from the student athletes. I mean, if you really think about it, there's companies all over the world that are evaluating the experience of the people who made a purchase. If
right.
I go and buy a Lexus, they're going to send me a survey that says, "Tell me what your experience was like purchasing the Lexus at Lexus of Pennsylvania," or whatever it might be. That happens over and over and over. I'm not sure how well institutions of higher education do that sometimes. I mean, I think we do a lot of looking across the landscape and say, oh, let's see what the best practices are at other places. But we get this information, and rather than assess it in our own context and say, hey, are there things that we need to do better, and work with the individuals that they have, they don't always necessarily do a good job of that. So the opportunity, and where I'm going, is take information from your customers. I know that's not a good term, but take the
No, I
information
love that
from
term.
customers, and get the feedback. And oh, by the way, you should probably do the same thing for your staff and your faculty, but start to get information about what the user experience is like. There's lots of companies out there that say the best way to have a great customer experience is to make sure you have satisfied employees. There's people putting in slides, and Google and all these places, they got smoothie bars and all this other stuff. um, those are real, and if you have satisfied employees, satisfied staff, you're going to have satisfied customers, aka students, and you're going to bring this all together with your data. But it gives you an opportunity to coach people up. You bring in the information, and you can work with people to make them better. So where are opportunities? Your human resources processes have to look different. The old style of, we'll do a once a year evaluation, and we'll sit down and we'll talk about things. I don't know if that's not going to get it done. Teaching evaluations, great opportunity to look and say, is that really bringing any value? And oh, by the way, once somebody gets a rating that says, geez, you're really not an effective teacher, does anything actually happen that requires that person to get better? The difference between athletics and other places is, in athletics, if you don't get it done, you're looking for another job. That's not always the case in the academy. There's a lot
Right.
of ability to exist within the system at a level that may not necessarily be the high performance that people expect and demand. Those are opportunities. So in an era where budgets are tight, making sure that your resources are being utilized as best as possible, and doing that through informed decision making via data, via analysis, via something that really gets at the heart of what you're trying to do, is where I think a lot of this needs to go. So
It's really interesting you bring up the HR piece. One of the topics I often talk about is how to recruit like an athletic director. And, it's interesting because in higher education, we often have a vacancy. We post the job as it was written. We go through a multi-month process. We do a nationwide search. And that doesn't happen. If a head coach in a high-powered college football program steps down or is fired or whatever it is, what is it, a matter of days? and you've got a new head coach, and that's because athletic directors always have lists of people that they know they want to work with. They always know what the talent sets are, and so how can we bring a little bit of that into not just maybe our HR processes, but potentially even the way that we recruit our students? How are we recruiting students in a way that is a little bit more personalized and a little bit more connected? So I couldn't agree with you more. We're going to leave it right there for this week. I want to thank you, Mike, for joining us for the week and sharing more about college athletics than I ever thought I would know. And honestly, you did. You moved the needle for me and helped me wrap my head around a lot of these things, and I appreciate you for doing that. We hope our audience will come back to us next week. We're going to be doing this one more time, same place. Until then, we'll say good night. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
Thanks, TJ. Have a good night.